Hear me?
It takes future-focused vision to find ideas that become solutions to the world's most pressing concerns. Innovation and creativity are the sparks that ignite to transform lives and society, and these need space to grow.
We are home to these creative and innovative sparks. Our work goes beyond the disciplines, across our 9 faculties, 7 campuses, and being one of Africa's top business schools. As an African global university, we stand proudly among the world's top universities. We remain at the forefront of universal discoveries and provide authentically African solutions to the world's greatest challenges and opportunities. We are pioneers in our fields, from the humanities to cutting-edge technologies, continually seeking ways to improve the world around us. Our hybrid learning systems provide quality education that enables graduates to become adaptable game changers. We have molded nearly 500,000 alumni who have made their mark locally and internationally, and we continue to inspire and equip our students to uphold our firmly rooted culture of excellence. At the heart of what we do is our people. They are creative, critical thinkers who can shape society for the better, because that is how we teach, learn, innovate, impact, and live. We are the University of Pretoria.
Esteemed guests, colleagues, alumni, alumni associates, and viewers everywhere, a very good evening to you, and welcome to tonight's installment of the LeadUP Alumni Thought Leadership Conversations series. I am Sebenzile Nkambule. I'm a broadcast journalist and a communications practitioner, and I have the pleasure of moderating this evening's discussion. Tonight's conversation's topic is South Africa at 30, what we've learned and what must happen next. Some of the topics we will speak about this evening include South Africa's institutions and systems of governance 30 years into democracy, the shortcomings and challenges we've experienced in the first 30 years, how our youth are experiencing our democracy and how that might shape their contribution to this country, and how sport has helped build bridges among South Africans. And the biggest question this evening is where to from here? How South Africa should move ahead for the next 30 years into our democratic era. Of course, this LeadUP conversation is brought to you by the University of Pretoria's Alumni Relations Office, which gathers thought-leading alumni and friends of the University of Pretoria to discuss topical issues affecting South Africa, Africa, as well as the rest of the world. As a UP alumni myself, I'm especially pleased to hear that among our panelists this evening, we have 3 who are UP alumni and 3 who are UP staff members. So without any further ado, let me introduce you to our panelists this evening. We'll start on my far right. Mr. David Kabwa is a 3-time UP graduate who's currently doing his 4th degree, a PhD in international relations at Tux, and he's also a former UP SRC president. We're joined online by Professor Themba Masego, who is, in fact, recently appointed, so congratulations to you, Professor, as the head of the Wits School of Governance. Professor Masego is also a board member of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and we're honored, Prof, to have you join us this evening on the eve of Madiba's birthday. We're also joined by Dr. Stembile Mbete, who is a senior lecturer in UP's Department of Political Sciences, a well-known political analyst, of course. You may see her across various television stations in the country, and is a UP PhD graduate. We're also joined online by Professor Sheena O'Connell, who is an African Studies scholar in UP's School of the Arts and a writer and film director who tackles big questions around democracy and freedom. Last and certainly not least, we are pleased to be joined by Mr. L.J. Van Zyl, a former Olympic athlete who's also a UP lecturer, and just like David, is a 3-time UP graduate who's currently busy with his PhD right here at the University of Pretoria. A very warm welcome to all of our expert panelists this evening, and thank you for being here with us and lending us your time and your thoughts on this important topic this evening, South Africa at 30. Before we jump in, we ask those of you joining us online to please jump in on the conversation. And when we get to question time, do also use that hashtag LeadUPConversation when posting about the event. Let's jump straight into it. And to kick us off, really, just to set the scene, to set the tone for us, Professor Masego, I'll start with you. Kindly reflect for us on what the significance of South Africa at 30 means for you and the work that you do.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this important conversation. I want to kick off by just making the point that I think the country has very good governance systems established over the past 30 years, and I think we owe a lot of gratitude to our forefathers, the drafters of the Constitution. Chief among include President Mandela, whose birthday we'll be celebrating in the next few days. They gave us a constitution which does a number of things. This includes protecting socioeconomic rights for every citizen. It creates a democratic state. It demands that regular elections be held, and I think we're having that. It also introduces the doctrine of separation of powers, with the legislature being the key mechanism of holding elected leaders accountable. And I think that I'm going to say 1 or 2 things about that. But the Constitution also establishes Chapter 9 institutions whose role is to make sure that power is not abused by the ruling elite, which is something that is often overlooked in these kinds of discussions. And then establishes 3 spheres of government, which was an attempt to say government needs to be closer to the people so that those who lead us are not actually sitting in ivory towers and not linked to the reality that people experience on a day-to-day basis. But it also ensures a very important principle, and that is public officials must be held accountable to the citizens. They need to understand that they rule not for themselves, but for the benefit of all of citizens. But the key question for me still remains, is this system of governance working? Has it worked for the majority of South Africans? And 30 years later, it's important for us to reflect on that. And in my view, largely, yes, the governance system has actually served the country in many positive ways. This includes, for example, the fact that there's increased access to healthcare, education, social housing, a social security net that helps the most poor in our society. But the question still remains about the quality of those services that the Constitution said we must provide to our citizens. And I think that's where the bulk of the discussion needs to focus on whether we're delivering quality services. But there are also problems that exist. We can't overlook them. And I'll just mention a few. The fact that there's still rising levels of inequality, of poverty, of unemployment, and you have many other issues, load shedding, et cetera, which actually, many of which have a class, gender, and a race dimension. In other words, all of these problems affect different classes, racial groups, and different genders in different ways. And as a country, we can't be thinking that we're making progress if we're not actually moving faster towards achieving equality. We have state institutions and the governance system that is also undermined, unfortunately, by corruption, maladministration, mismanagement, which, in my view, is a major contributor to the fact that we are still talking about challenges that existed prior to 1994. And the biggest issue for me will also be the fact that, the one institution that the Constitution established was the legislature, which was meant to actually achieve a greater level of accountability. And this has actually been undermined. And we've seen Parliament actually failing to hold public officials accountable, did not provide sufficient oversight over the past 30 years, and did not, importantly, enable stakeholders to have direct influence on policy. So the consequences of this, unfortunately, is that we have a dissatisfied electorate. These things have also undermined the confidence in democratic institutions, where people feel they'd rather protest than use democratic institutions because they believe these institutions will not yield the results that they're looking for. So one could even say that there's a governance crisis in the country, especially from the electorate point of view, who are feeling unheard, disaffected, and actually alienated from democracy itself. And even voices beginning to say this constitution is not serving the ordinary person in the street. So those are real issues that we need to talk about. But let me conclude, I'll come back later on by making the following points. That the governance system was a deliberate choice by those who drafted the Constitution. And the view was really to build a new, accountable, and a transparent state. However, the political system that we ended up with as a country was not custom designed, in my view, to fulfill the objectives of the Constitution. We ended up with a system that I would term a dictatorship of the party. That is, a party that gets majority of the votes becomes in charge of the state and can do what it likes because other democratic institutions, such as Parliament, were not able to hold the governing party accountable. The key weakness, in my view, is not so much whether there's a challenge about the governance systems themselves, but is the system that was put in place and how power was exercised, which was not to the benefit of the majority of citizens in many ways that I've mentioned. So in my view, the governance system is as good as the people who are managing and running that governance system. And I think that's the next challenge as we're starting to think ahead about how to make those or hold those who are in charge of this governance system accountable to the citizens of the country. Let me
Professor,
stop there for now as my introduction.
yes, yes. We will come back and ask you to double click on a number of those points that you've touched on. Dr. Mbete, let me come to you. I mean, a mouthful there from Professor Masego talking about the importance of the legislature. I mean, not even being an impeached judge precludes you from being a lawmaker. We'll get to some of those issues. But back to that opening question of, for you, what are perhaps some of the initial feelings even and thoughts that surface when you think about this important milestone that we've reached as a country, reaching 30 years of democracy?
Thanks so much, Sebenzile. I think Prof. Masego has really sketched out really well for us kind of what the intentions were behind the system and kind of how it's been experienced in the last 30 years. I always go back to the founding provisions of the Constitution. Section 1D of the Constitution says that South Africa will be based on universal adult suffrage, national common voters' roll, regular elections, multi-party system of democratic government. But for me, the most important part of it is it says to ensure accountability, responsiveness, and openness. And I think particularly there, the accountability and the responsiveness of the government that is elected by the citizens who are able to vote regularly is really what's been missing, or what hasn't quite been experienced by many South Africans for the last 30 years. And so our Constitution itself establishes a participatory democracy. On paper, South Africans not only have the right to vote, but also have the right to contribute to legislative processes, so to lawmaking, to comment on budgetary processes at all three spheres, and to be part of planning processes at municipal level. So on paper, South Africa has the perfect participatory democracy, but what we know is that that isn't how it's experienced. You've seen different state institutions really treat participatory democracy exercises as like tick box exercises. There'll be a public participation in Bizo somewhere, and then that's it. And so you haven't had opportunities created for meaningful engagement by people with the institutions that are set out and established in the Constitution, and what that means. And for a number of reasons, including the dominance of one party. And what that means is that you've had people then check out of the system, because the government that's in place, government officials, politicians, elected representatives just aren't responsive to the grievances that get raised by people. And so you've had a lot of citizens decide that actually it's more effective to engage in informal ways, like protesting, than it is to engage in a kind of a meaning, through the formal system. So for me, just that inability of our system to really fulfill the promise that's all there is really the experience of the last 30 years. So there's so much that's been done. There's so much that has been achieved. I certainly wouldn't be here without the democracy that we have. I wouldn't have achieved nearly as much as I have been able to in a different time. But unfortunately, I think that the work is nowhere near being done. And my concern is that certainly what we've seen in the last few years is a reversal of so much that was done at the beginning, so that the students that I teach don't necessarily have the same kinds of opportunities that I had the experience of having when I was their age 20 years ago. Yeah, and that's a concern.
Thank you, Dr. Mbete. David, let me bring you into the discussion as well. Do young people really have a good enough appreciation, right, of the cost of this democracy, that 30 years on, people choose to opt out. They choose not to participate in various ways, choose to not show up at the polls. Is there a good enough appreciation of really what this milestone means, and what does it mean for you?
Thank you so much. Yes, young people do have a deep appreciation. The issue is that there is a disconnect between the appreciation and the outcome. So we are very well aware of the great strides that have been taken for us to be where we are today. The problem is in our contemporary reality, we do not see this. 30 years into our democracy, very little in reality has changed. I spent the last couple of months traveling around the country speaking to young people, and the common thread and theme is disgruntlement. Disgruntlement because why is it when so many great strides have been made that material realities in the lives of so many ordinary South Africans have not changed? It is my view that every South African is an activist, and I think there are 4 kinds of activism. There is the disruptor, which, as we've spoken about, is the most prevalent form of activism. There is what we call the change maker. They look at the issue identified by a disruptor and they decide to come up with a solution. There is then what we refer to as the active citizen who mobilizes on those issues. And then fourthly, there is the reformer, those who sit at the table and ensures that what the other 3 groups have done is actually brought to reality. Now, because reformers have not been doing their jobs, as Dr. Mbete has mentioned, this is why we see that growing level of discontentment. So it is not that young people are not voting purely out of disgruntlement. It is because in many instances, we do not see ourselves represented in these spaces, which is a great source of frustration 30 years into our democracy. We are in a watershed moment, and I believe we have a very unique opportunity at this time, given the makeup of our current government, to demonstrate a greater sense of agency. So as far as the work that I'm doing, I think that is what is most important. Political education that is geared towards us understanding the role, responsibility, but also the power that we have. I think 30 years into this democracy, it's important, as Prof mentioned in the very beginning, to emphasize the power that we have for accountability, but also for participation and playing a more active role in shaping how South Africa moves forward.
Professor O'Connell, let me bring you into the conversation as well, what this milestone means for you, and how would you characterize where the country is currently? Professor O'Connell, are you still with us? All right, we'll come back to Professor O'Connell. LJ?
Yeah, we can celebrate on the sporting front. We have milestones to celebrate. Actually, last week we have actually also milestone to celebrate KG. KG, the Wimbledon wheelchair play on the doubles. Monjane, she brought back a Wimbledon title. And then we have several other milestones. We can track it down to 2021, where Wade Finnick had the world record in the 400, 2016. Wade again, Caster Semenya, Akane Sembinewik. And 2012, the first time Banyana played at the Olympic Games. And we can track it down to 2004, the Olympic gold, 2000. But in my opinion, yes, we have milestones, but currently we have, I think, 89 medals at the Olympic Games since reinstated from 92. And in my view, it's little. And also, if you look at the Olympic team at the moment, the female representation is limited. I think the athletics team, the females, is 8 or 10 athletes. Imagine. Wow. So in that case, the females is not well presented. But in the work I do at the moment at the university, Department of Humanities Education, so we also try to transform the curriculum to include all students in our classes. Specifically, one of the modules is human movement studies. And we have a module, it's swim practical for the education students. And not too long ago, athletes couldn't take the module if they cannot swim. And currently we have learned to swim coaches to include all the students, so we tailor the curriculum to cater for all our students. And in fact, one of my master's students graduated specifically on this topic, where I remember I think it was 2021 about, When we asked a group of about 180 students, the Groenkloof campus swimming pool, we have seen this size swimming pool in your life ever before? And the majority of the class said no. Right. So what we do now, or we have a chance, or we split the class, non-swimmers and swimmers, and then we decided, no, we're going to get learn-to-swim coaches, volunteers who helped. And now we have a transformed module in the department where students, 90 students, haven't even seen a pool. And also now we have students got the opportunity to get exposed to swimming pool. Maybe 10 years from now, we will see some of that students that got introduced into the swimming practical module in the LA Olympics, or possibly 32. So that's only small changes how we can turn this around. As David said, at 30, South Africa now in the sporting front, it's a watershed. We'll get to the leadership one. It's now for us make or break.
Thank you for that, LJ. We'll go to Professor O'Connell in just a bit. I'm not sure if we have her back on the line. But maybe, LJ, let me stick with you on how we've used sport in this country, right? Because and I think Professor Masego, in his opening remarks, started to speak up about the fractures, right, in society. Yeah. That we have this beautiful story to tell, but at the same time, it's a very painful story to tell. And sport has truly been a great tool to bring people together. We would have been together commiserating that 1-point loss just a couple of days ago against Ireland. And again, we'll be looking forward to watching the Olympians in a couple of weeks' time. But it almost feels as though that euphoria, that excitement is very short-lived, because as soon as the match is over and we get back to the day-to-day realities, it's tough and ugly again. How has sport been used, and how do we perhaps try and elongate that feeling of oneness and togetherness that we generally tend to feel when supporting one of our sporting teams?
Yes, Sebenzile. So we've hosted a few big tournaments. We've got the FIFA World Cup, the Rugby World Cup, the netball, the cricket. And at that week or two, there is a unifying effect. You get that stadium, it's full stadium, and different race groups support different sporting codes. Yeah. But I think we need to take one step also back and also try to transform also our school curriculum at school sport level and include that as well. What is the healing process that we speak about? What is inclusiveness? And I think it's boils down to the education in school level and then also in higher education. I was very privileged to be in the high performance level for 17 years, and I represented South Africa at 3 Olympic Games, 2008, 12 and 16. And I've seen definitely changes for the better, more cohesive effect in the team environment, where there's friendships is definitely born. And that's the power of sport. Like President Nelson Mandela spoke about, and this is the practical examples of it. We have also the Olympic Day once a year in June, where our students, they work in communities and start teaching the Olympic the values. And in my opinion, if we can live off the Olympic values, half of our problems and issues is addressed. So this is small changes that I will definitely recommend.
Thank you for that. Professor Sheena O'Connell, we have you back now. Let's get your own reflections on what this milestone actually means. And perhaps if you could speak in particular to the point around, you know, dreams of unity and freedom do remain elusive for many in this country as well. In the work that you do, you address big topics of justice, of democracy. You speak to issues of place and belonging. Unpack that for us a bit in the context of reflecting on this milestone of South Africa at 30.
Thank you very much for having me. And well, we've been having our own little party off camera whilst we've tried to reconnect. And I think it's with a weariness and a sadness and a healthy dose of anger that I reflect on the last 30 years. because during the last 30 years, on our collective watch, we had 34 miners massacred in Marikana. We have the likes of Uyuneni, Jocelyn, Unisebo, who speak about whose deaths, tragic, violent deaths, speak to us about gender-based violence, let alone intimate partner violence that is prolific in South Africa. We talk about, Jocelyn speaks to us about missing children, of which there are thousands, and the tragedy, of course, of this 3-year-old toddler who dies in a pit latrine toilet in a creche, of which they're estimated to be thousands across the country. So this seems to be my 30 years. And I'm left asking myself, how many Rolex watches and how many displays of ostentatious wealth at openings of Parliament and all the fancy gear, how much more must taxpayers pay for that kind of lifestyle, to exchange it for one pit latrine toilet, to exchange it for the safety of women and children, and to exchange it for the sanctity of dignity as enshrined in our constitution for LGBTQ persons who live in our country, particularly those who live in KZN. I asked too, how much of the last 30 years has seen a shift of the needle in Black land ownership, that whilst there has been some strides made in the land restitution program in terms of cash payouts, how much of that has really attended to the shifting of land ownership, and how much of that remains unaddressed. And of course, I say all of this against the backdrop of the catastrophic floods that not only hit KZN, but recently the Western Cape, where all of the thousands and thousands of displaced people who have lost absolutely everything are those who live there as a result of our apartheid past and apartheid spatial planning. So the last 30 years, and I'm old enough to remember that liberatory moment of 1994. I voted in Sandton, and of these winding crowds, and I remember watching Nelson Mandela take the oath of office and being saluted by the heads, of the various military wings, thinking nothing was impossible for this country. And I think what we were sold out on was the idea that the next 30 years, or certainly the next 10 to 15 years, had to see a buckling down and a sacrifice of sorts. And I refer to an analogy that my uncle, Professor Brian O'Connell, used to be at UWC, said. South Africa is equivalent, that moment during apartheid, South Africa was the equivalent of a family who had 3 children. They could afford to buy each child a pair of Nike trainers. Overnight, that family spreads to 30 kids. And it's no longer Nike trainers, but we're lucky to have each child have a pair of rubber flip-flops. And we've never understood that to get to this unarticulated freedom that we haven't reached, we had to buckle down and sacrifice and think it through those hard questions of what it means to be South African. I don't think we've even begun to scrape the surface of that. We have Heritage Day that is as disparate as all the colors of this pseudo rainbow nation. That disrupts the threads of what we think. We talk about us as South Africans, but I've yet to see an idea or an identity coming through of what that really means in practice. So I think we don't have the luxury of another 30 years to do this all over again. And I think we have to ask these kinds of hard questions of ourselves as to what kind of human beings we want to be and what hard choices we need to make. So I come from a background where we were raised in a colored family, where we understood we had to live in a certain place, play a certain role, live in the shadows, live on the margins. And a lot of that, as my colleagues have articulated, has changed. I would not probably be here if it wasn't for the last 30 years. But I also think we've lost the ability to stand together as as communities who care, and communities of kindness, and communities of resilience. And I say so because when we were growing up, we were well versed in what would happen if a family member was arrested, if a teenage cousin was arrested due to student protests, if the family priest was stuck in solitary confinement. We knew what it was for families to be visiting family members on Robben Island. And somehow you worked together to make sure that we looked out for each other and that things were okay on our watch. So I don't understand why we haven't, well, in part I do, because the 1994 moment comes, and of course we've got to, ostensibly there's no need for these community bonds. There's no longer need for street committees and church committees and these structures that hold vulnerable communities together. Those kind of things all disappeared. A large part, in fact, to forced removals, but also 1994 came, and now we were liberated. We were able to vote whilst, and I don't think we've had that opportunity to hold ourselves accountable and to govern ourselves in a way that holds the governing parties to account, but also those of us as members of a South African society who are invested in staying here. Thank you.
Perhaps still with you, Sheena. Who, in your view, has the moral legitimacy to almost lead or create another 94 moment? Perhaps some would have said when the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, came into office, post what was a very difficult 9 years, wasted 9 years, I think is the phrase we all throw about, would have thought that perhaps he was the individual to lead that. And fast forward to where we are now. If we are trying to recreate another 94 moment, who has the moral legitimacy to lead that?
I think the fact that you're asking that question, it shows the problematics of that answer. And I think the idea that we're looking for yet another Messiah is as fraught as the dollar bill stuffed down a couch arm. It's as complicated as that. So I think the ideas of us looking for a Messiah to lead us out of this is not going to happen, and it shouldn't happen. I think the power should rest in the inherent strength and resilience that we have, because we have to be strong to get through this country. You have to be strong to survive in all sorts of places, not least of all in a university. You need to be strong to be a domestic worker going to work every day, and the only kind of realization that life is different from your madam is when the floods are happening and you're not able to get to work on time. So life is hard, but I think there's strength in that resilience, and I think we need to take this power back. I think we need to lean on each other, not tear each other down. I think we're really good at that, and realize that at the heart of every stranger that we meet, every face that we come across, the urgency is there to recognize that somebody is human at the heart of it. So let's say, for example, we have the Usindiso building fire. We don't kind of have a reflection by too many people in South Africa. Well, their lives didn't really matter that much because they weren't South African. So I think we need to have a reckoning with ourselves as to what it was that could get us to 1994, and how do we take it back? And also think that it's particularly I'm really lucky to be working with a group of former exiles. They were youngsters, 17, 18-year-olds, who went into exile to fight for the anti-apartheid struggle. And I'm struggling to think if I could find 17 and 18-year-olds right now who are able to make those decisions and able to make that sacrifice. So I think we need to lead by example, and I don't think it's by looking to our leaders. We're looking for those examples. I think we find it in absolutely the everyday, in people who make life work against the most difficult circumstances and background, rather than looking for any kind of Messiah to come and rescue us and take us into the next rainbow.
There's a lot of agreement in studio, and I do want to bring you all back in just a moment. But Professor Masego, let me come back to you. If the Messiah isn't the answer, one would then hope that the systems would hold. Let's perhaps reflect on that as well, whether or not some of the key choices, the decisions made in how we approached building this new country at the time were the best choices that we made, given where we are 30 years later. You've muted yourself, Professor.
I agree with the idea that we should not look for another Mandela to come up. But what we need is actually systems that need to be put in place that will produce a generation of leaders in all spheres of the country, that is in business, in civil society, but also in political parties. Because part of the problem is, in my view, is just citizens, skilled, talented people are disengaging from public life, largely because the public sphere is discredited. Anybody involved in politics, government is seen as corrupt, and so the most talented people, some sitting in the podium there, are beginning to see politics as something not to get involved in. But there are other ways of participating where individuals can actually, in the form of civil society structures in communities, to get involved. But for me, the most important thing that we need to do is to identify institutions and build capacity around those institutions that will ensure our future, that will ensure greater levels of accountability. Because fortunately, the recent elections, and it's important for us to also mention that, in fact, it's forcing the state in a way, or the country in a way, to begin to have a diversity of ideas go into government, instead of the same old ideas coming from one single, very large party that was dominant over the past couple of years. So with the emergence of new ideas, new energy, and I think that we're seeing some generational mix, not enough, but we're seeing a new change. Those fresh new ideas need to be fed into the system so that we can begin to build institutions. But we also need to do something to change the political institutions, not government institutions, political parties themselves, because they're the ones who are actually presenting people who end up running these institutions that we think can strengthen our democracy. So if political parties are not putting enough effort and energy in producing good leaders who can then be presented to run municipalities, provinces, departments, state-owned institutions, then we run into real serious problems. So issue of capacity building of these political parties, in my view, is also absolutely vital. But again, citizens, human beings, everybody in the country need to begin to see themselves as participants, as players who can actually make the change. We must stop believing that change is going to come from some individual or from some party. We as citizens must become the change. And I think once we do that, we'll be making tremendous progress as a country.
Dr. Mbete, on the point about at least the shift that we saw from the recent elections as well, we look at the configuration, for example, of the Gauteng provincial government, what we're seeing at national level. You may have those who are welcoming that there are newer voices now who are in positions of leadership. But then you look at what happened in KZN, there'll be people in fact, who gave 40-odd% of their support to the MK party, but have no representation in that provincial leadership. That's a bunch of people who may feel as though, yes, we went out, we made a different choice, but somehow the system still managed to silence us in some way because we're not being represented in that way. Is it possible to find some sort of a balance, if you will?
Well, I think that we must be careful in the way that, I think what this election, the most exciting thing about this election for me as somebody that teaches political science is that you suddenly had lots of people interested in politics and in all the institutions. So one of the things around our system is that we have a parliamentary system. We don't have a presidential system. We don't have a system of executive authority. Yeah. We have a system of legislative authority. So everyone who has elected people who have ended up in a provincial legislature or in the National Assembly has representation. And the the executive that then is that comes to the president and then the cabinet, and in the province the premier and the provincial and the members of their executive council come from those legislatures. So the people of KZN who voted for the MK are being represented by the MK in the provincial legislature, and that's really important because there's a lot of important work about running that province that happens in the provincial legislature. Of course, they don't have a direct representation in the coalition government that is then running KZN, but their representatives within the provincial legislature are going to be hugely important in holding that coalition government accountable, in ensuring that delivery happens in the way that they want it to. So I think that, part of what we've seen with this election is a normalizing of our system. We have a proportional representation system of elections. PR systems all over the world lead to no single party having a majority of over 50%, and so different parties having to govern with each other in some kind of coalition. And that we have not had that at national level and in most provinces, we've had it in some provinces, but that we haven't had it at national level since 1994 is the exception rather than the rule. So what you've had in this election is that our electoral system creating the results that we expected that it was going to lead to. And our constitution is in very many ways written for and designed for power sharing, that parties are supposed to work with each other, so that even the parties that are in the executive in KZN can't govern in exclusion completely of those parties that aren't in the executive because they need those parties in order to make certain decisions. And so I think that what this is an opportunity for is to really think of our system in the kind of collaborative power sharing way that it was supposed to be. But secondly, and this is to both Sheena's point and to Prof. Masego's point around needing to recenter the focus of our politics from just the politicians to actually the residents and the citizens of South Africa. Yeah. And what's the power that we have in community? Because, this election had the lowest voter turnout of any national election, 58%, down from 66%. And a huge driver from that was young people checking out of the system. In 2014, 58% of 18 to 29-year-olds were registered to vote. That went down to 49% in 2019. It went down to 38% in 2024. So basically, if the legitimacy of your system is participation in it, then if you've got fewer and fewer people participating, then it really affects the legitimacy of your democratic system. And the last thing I want to end on is that I think that to the point that Prof. Masego made around political parties. I read the founding provisions of the Constitution earlier, and it says that South Africa is a multi-party system. And our Constitution has put in place all sorts of robust systems, but it's completely silent, other than it being a multi-party system, on political parties. So our political parties are treated in law as private organizations. Yes. We know more about JSE-listed companies than political parties. And yet those are the places where we get our leadership. So I think that that's going to be something that we do need to interrogate and to get community interests, to get young people's interests into formal politics in a much more deliberate way in order to achieve the kind of changes that we want to see in the next 30 years. Mm-hmm.
David, for people, not only young people, I mean, there are many people who are, with their, late 40s, close to their 50s, never voted a day in their lives because they don't believe in this democratic project. For those who would have hoped that this particular election will really bring about radical change, are left perhaps a little disappointed because it does feel a bit as though it's business as usual with just a few new faces and a new configuration, if you will, of how government is set up. For those who are wanting some sort of a radical transformation, where will they find it?
I really appreciate that question because it comes back to the earlier conversation we had about agency. What is very important at this time is really the notion of political education. As Dr. Mbete was saying, In my conversations with young people all across the country, one thing that came across very, very clearly is that we do not know the mechanisms that are available to us in order to make the meaningful contributions we want to make. For example, on election day, I had over 200 young people personally message me saying, I got to my voting station and I'm being chased away and I do not know why. I've had so many young people approach me saying, what is Section 24? I do not understand what this is. And besides political education, there is also the need to understand the parliamentary system in and of itself. That's so many young people who say, well, we elected leaders and we don't know what happened to them. And I would ask, okay, well, do we take the time to actually go and find out what is readily available in terms of the information? One thing I would consistently do is organize for young people to sit in various portfolio committee sittings. And what I would find is when those young people would go back into communities, the narrative had completely changed because that narrative was now driven by an understanding. So when we speak about radical change, oftentimes the notion of radicalism is associated with the notion of dismantling, of systemic change, but also systemic breaks. However, we are actually operating within a system that does allow for us to be radical. We do not need to constantly be breaking down walls and reinventing the wheels. We simply need to take our seat, bring it to the table, and make sure that we are represented. And represented is not only having seats in Parliament, it is, as Prof was mentioning, ensuring we find ourselves in civil society, in non-governmental organizations, but also making sure that our community-based work is effective, it is alive, it is relevant, but more than anything, it is active, because that's where we will really start to see agency. So I invite the notion of radical thought, because we cannot continue with business as usual. The problem is we recognize that, okay, well, it's not business as usual, or maybe it is business as usual, and then we keep quiet and we don't really do anything besides pointing out that there is a problem. And I very much encourage young people to get active with our disgruntlement. There was an old saying that if you're upset, vote. But more than that, if you're upset, do something. And I believe we have the power to do something.
As you're speaking, David, I'm thinking about the young people of Kenya right now. A couple of years ago, we used to make reference a lot to the Arab Spring. Do you think that South Africa needs its own Kenya moment? Because for those who are saying, well, voting hasn't really done anything, do we need to perhaps look at what's happening there?
I think so long as what happens is really aligned with what we see in our constitution. And what I mean by that is, you mentioned the conversation about an impeached judge. And when reading through those reports, the term that was thrown around quite a bit was constitutional delinquent. And I think it is a term that really we have not really paid enough attention to. I think we do need to upset the system in order to create change. Now, the change that we are going to create must be a change that does not operate in isolation. Now, you can imagine after instances such as the Arab Springs, as I mentioned before, after a disruptor has pointed out an issue, reformers must sit at the table. So the level of thinking and planning that goes into pushing for what is essentially a paradigm shift must be driven by the understanding that it cannot operate in silos. So long as it's constitutional, I think we should go for it. We have the agency. Plus, it is a constitutionally protected activity.
Let's shift gears now and look at what next, right? What does the future look like? And let me remind our online audience, we'll be taking your questions in just a few minutes. But LJ, everything rests and falls on leadership, right? And even I think in this conversation we're having now, when we think leaders, we think politicians, we think politics. We don't think about VCs of institutions of higher education. We don't think about captains of teams, principals of schools, and so on. therein perhaps might also be what is a big part of the problem here is that we think leadership is limited to certain spheres, to certain people, and not society broadly. What will the role of leadership be, and across all of society, for the next 30 years?
See, Benzile, you're 100% right. It all falls in relies now on strong leadership. But recently, I've read all the statements from the new appointment minister, Gayton McKenzie, and he also said in one of his first remarks was he's going to run a marathon.
Yes.
So he's going to lead by example. He also touched on the physical education will be a standalone module besides life orientation. And it's small steps. And okay, that's top management. Strong vision, clear vision, transparent. As I speak from a high performance athlete's point of view, I don't want to hear about super fans spending millions
yes.
in sporting events. While somebody also mentioned and Rolex watches, as Professor and mentioned, and business class tickets, we want to see community engagement opportunities. Yeah. We want to see leaderships in the local municipalities. Let me tell you this story. I'm involved in Dreamfield's a sports project for the athletic side. And last year, we did a clinic for coaches. It's staff members of teachers. And some of the teachers, about 30, 35 years old, there was then Bushbuck Ridge, close to the Kruger. And some of one of the events was hurdles. And I pinpoint, and I took videos of some of the teachers who did this 3-step hurdle. It's like rhythm, it's basics. And I must say, and I asked the teachers, have you ran ever hurdles in your life? She said, no. So that's an athlete 10 years ago. She's possibly too old now, but this is the time of gems that we need to identify in high school level and take them all the way through, put them in a system, through the proper leadership, and then we will have not a small representation of especially female athletes. This is what leadership needs. And it's not only the top level, throughout the university system, school level, and we also need more coaches that can coach. And also the talent identification is super important. We've got now a scholar in Kiro Hazelwood that's going for the 100 meters relay to Paris. So somebody spotted him and gave him an opportunity with a coach, and look what happens. We need more stories like that, more narratives, and we need more role models that can also act as leader. And I always say my door is always open to any athlete who need advice or coaching advice, or even at the community engagement level. I'm always open, and my students are also doing a lot of community engagement work, and this is where we're going to make a difference. So the way forward, in summary, strong leadership, not only top level, throughout the university, provincial, municipalities, and this is where we're going to have the same conversation 30 years ago, and then I'm going to tell you this is how we did it.
So it's a good thing that Minister McKenzie is running a marathon.
Well, it can be, but it's easy to say a marathon, but to actually do it, to implement it, and that's also one of the points I would like to end off. It's easier if we have the systems, as we spoke about, but the implementation of it, this is where I'm interested in. A paper means nothing. I want to see the changes. I want to see the opportunities as being created.
Absolutely. Sheena, let's come back to you. What role will the preservation of culture, history, and heritage play going forward in South Africa to heal the fractures of the past?
I think it's asking a lot of heritage history to do all of that. I'm going to go back a little bit to your earlier question, thinking about the way forward, and how, and then try and marry this with your question about heritage. I mean, what is it that we've inherited, and what is it that we are going to bequeath when we leave? And I'd like to think that we're not going to bequeath a deeply unequal society, that one doesn't need a Gini coefficient to know is deeply unequal. I think that's the only thing we've really held on to really well, is that number one spot of the most unequal society in the world. I'd like to think that by looking to the past and seeing the incredible contributions made by women, particularly to the anti-apartheid struggle and to our road to democracy, that I cannot see any reason why women are still sitting on the sideline. I struggle that there are 20, and I'm not knocking any single vice chancellor. I hold my job very dear. I hold my salary paycheck very dear. But I struggle as to why we have 20 vice chancellors who are men in our tertiary institution landscape. Surely it can't be, I heard Alge talk about the disparity in the Olympic team, but you don't actually have to go as far as Paris. Just look on the campus that we inhabit. That things are not where they should be, and I struggle that it's 30 years that we haven't made the strides that we ought to have made. So this is what we're inheriting, and I'd like to think that the creative cultures, the creative industries, and heritage and museums, and the histories that have brought us to this point, there are enough lessons and enough spaces for it to become a vibrant space of dialogue. Museums and heritage spaces should not be places where we go to look at something. It should become vibrant spaces where we look for answers and where we can bring in young people, where we talk about these things that affect on a daily level. Why is it that we are on our Pearl study, our reading for meeting literacy skills, it's absolutely shocking that a child who goes to St. John's or Bishop's or Rodin from age 4-5 is streets ahead, is out of those starting blocks, LJ, far ahead before a child from a rural area or a township. It takes so much for them to even get to those starting blocks. So I don't buy for a moment that, well, if we just work harder, we're going to be more successful. I don't think it works like that. I think the system is set up. So if we can bring our past into this present and into a future where those of us who fought in the anti-apartheid struggle, we realized we had to stick together. We had to read. We had to have a love of learning. And we had to be able to imagine something bigger and better. And I don't think young people are able to do that because so much has been taken away. They're living for the majority of South African youth who are poor, for hundreds of thousands of schoolgirls who can't attend school for about 40 days a year because they can't afford sanitary products. How do we start breaking down those kinds of limitations so that they can take their places in South Africa where they feel equally comfortable at a country club, a golf club, a fine dining restaurant as they do at home? So how do we equip them to be able to read those codes, understand the old boys and old girls networks, and imagine a place in which they want to live and in which they want to participate? And I think for those of us who are a lot older, we need to learn from the youth. And I think we need to listen to them and to bring them into these spaces where heritage and culture and all these kinds of things. It's not the domain of a few graying professors. It really is a place for young people to take ownership of and to hold the society to account. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheena. Professor Masego, let's come to you as well. What the next 30 years should be defined by? How do we thrive as a democracy? What should our role be in the region, on the continent, globally, as well as we look to perhaps try and cement our place as a leader? Maybe we've lost it over the last couple of years. How do we regain it? And what should the next 3 decades be defined by, in your view? Professor, you've muted again.
Yeah, it's an age problem. we have to remain optimistic about the future of the country. I think that there's still great things going for us, and there's a lot that we need to do. And the starting point is actually sessions of this nature, conversations that include young people, but also we need to have the decision makers being part of these kinds of conversations so that they get direct feedback. We got to make sure that we take the power back to the hands of citizens, because at this particular point in time, so many things are going wrong in the country, but ordinary citizens are feeling powerless. There's very little that they can do to actually make a difference. So I think that pressing that reset button becomes important. You then have to have a capable, strong, ethical leadership that actually begins to make sure that the levers of the state function and operate effectively. So having a capable state, in my view, is quite important, because unless we address issues of poverty, inequality, unemployment, where people are going hungry every night, all these beautiful ideas that we're talking about mean nothing to ordinary citizens. So that's the major focus that we have to do. And then obviously building a strong and inclusive economy that benefits everyone, not just the managers and leaders, but every citizen in the country must actually feel they can actually benefit from that. And then becoming what we wanted to be at the beginning of the past 30 years. We saw ourselves as, I think the term we use, entry point to the continent or something like that. As a country, we need to move much faster to encourage intra and regional countries in the continent, because we have to understand that South Africa will not thrive and succeed if the rest of the continent is not actually experiencing economic growth. So we have an important role to play as an economic hub of this continent, to make sure that we partner with our sister countries to build a strong regional and continental economy. At global level, I think that the biggest contribution we can make as a country is to be the advocate of human rights and social justice across the globe. And that must be the shining touch that we take to each and every forum and opportunity we get to actually promote human rights and social justice and equality for all in the globe. And I think that we've already, during Madiba's time, we're able to play that role. We're beginning to play that role, but the world needs to hear the voice of South Africa, but also moving from a very strong base. In that strong base, in my view, is when we've looked after our citizens, we've looked after our country, we've looked after our continent, then we can actually go to the rest of the world and convey messages of peace, justice, human rights, and social justice.
Professor Masego, let me put you on the spot to Professor O'Connell's point about the gender question. Why aren't we getting it right, both at national government, but also at institutional level, such as in institutions of higher learning?
You know, that is a real challenge. And I think in my opening address, I did say that many of these challenges that we're talking about have a race, a gender, and a class dimension to it. And Professor Sheena raised the one about gender. I think it's an important challenge that we face. We're not doing enough. At the political level, if one may use that example, we're seeing more and more women being given key positions at the political level as ministers. We see more women being appointed in other senior positions. But when you go to the private sector, you don't see the same trend. And then universities, which are supposed to be the centers of excellence for our country, are themselves not leading by example. I'm the newly appointed head of school. The school has never had a woman as a head of school. So I think that the tertiary sector is particularly facing this challenge of making sure that we come up with clear programs that are designed to remove all the ceilings, the glass ceilings that exist in our universities, in our companies, and even in our homes, which makes it impossible or difficult for women to actually climb the ladder. But it has to be a conscious effort that all of us need to take responsibility for.
Thank you, Prof. Masego. Dr. Mbete, perhaps if you could pick up on that, but also what in your view, the impact and the influence really of this new configured government, the so-called GNU, what impact that may have on really where South Africa goes from here?
Well, you know, I think, like I said earlier, we're seeing our systems normalized into what it's supposed to lead to, right? So that we've got a system of, you know, a GNU is a kind of coalition government, is a particular type of coalition government, and so that we've got this GNU now at national level and different configurations and across different provinces, I think is our new normal. I don't think we'll ever get to a place, for as long as we have within our constitution the requirement for every election to result in proportional representation, I don't think we'll ever go back to a place where there is one party that gets well over 50% to be able to govern nationally. And so, given that, I've been quite encouraged actually by how much the system's kind of held up. You know, there were all sorts of expectations of violence and people saying, the ANC is never going to give away power peacefully, and that didn't materialize. All of the sort of worries of violence, of instability that people had didn't materialize. And what I've been surprised by is that even the state institutions, and we talk a lot about how politicized our state administration is, but it's ticked over. You know, you haven't had, I mean, we've got deep service delivery problems, which Prof. Masego has spoken about, but you haven't seen a kind of collapse of the system or a disruption of the system any more than than the problems that we deal with ordinarily. And so that, I think, is should be an encouragement to all of us 30 years in. I mean, we've spoken a lot around what all the problems are of the 30 years in. Yeah. But a few years ago, I remember meeting a Canadian diplomat who had last come to South Africa in 1981. And he came back to South Africa, I think it was 2017 or so. And he was shocked. He'd come to South Africa as a young man, new in the service. And he said to me, we expected South Africa to be what Syria is now. That the expectation was that South Africa was going to burn in racial conflagration, so the very fact that we avoided that, I think, is something to be proud of. Of course, there are so many issues and problems that we need to deal with, but I think that on its own should be a lesson that we take and testament of our resilience, as Prof. Sheena spoke about, but also of our ability to solve problems, to sit with each other under very difficult circumstances, and then to find solutions together. What we need, though, now, and I think in terms of the hope, I think, our sort of a politics of hope, or what I hope comes from this GNU, is that the leadership collective actually brings in the voices of the people who are the majority of South Africans, which is the 61% of South Africans that are under the age of 35. 61% of South Africans under the single biggest age group is between 15 and 29. There's about 15 million of them, and we are not hearing them. And I think that there's a serious work to be done to actually hear what they say, what their issues are, and what their solutions are. Because, for a country with a Gini coefficient, with the levels of inequality that we have, with the levels of poverty that we have, the fact that we don't have as much kind of death, we've got very high levels of crime, so we see it manifested in that way, and a lot of violent crime and interpersonal violent crime. Yeah. But the fact that we haven't seen a complete collapse is because when you go into communities, young people are doing things. They're organizing themselves. They are organizing, street committees, policing forums, keeping their environment safe, and finding ways to occupy themselves despite the fact that we've got a 60% youth unemployment rate. And so my hope is that now that we're in this new area of governing collaboratively, that we can get our politicians to understand that they don't just need to govern in coalition with each other, but they need to govern in coalition with society, and to actually bring in and to put at the center the people that their decisions affect the most. Yeah. And I think that that's sort of the next step for me for giving meaning to our democracy.
And how do we avoid not falling into this idea of a South African exceptionalism? I mean, even our international, colleagues in media, for example, were quite shocked, wondering, like, where's the violence? Where's stuff burning because of the results of the elections? And there wasn't any of that. But we can very quickly get into that space of thinking, oh, we're so special, we're so exceptional. So what do we do to ensure that we realize there's still a lot of work to be done, but of course still pat ourselves on the back that we've come this far?
We get to work. I mean, that's the thing. I think it's LJ who talked about the implementation, right? That you can be proud of what you've done, and you'll know this as an athlete. You can be proud of what you've achieved, but then know that you need to then get to the next step. Given that it's Mandela Day tomorrow, in Long Walk to Freedom, and he says he reached the peak of a mountain and then realized that there was another one to climb or something. I'm hashing that quote. But the point I'm making is that you can recognize what you've done and still recognize how much more you have to do. And it's not an either or. And I think often the narrative of South African exceptionalism is something we hold on to avoid doing the work, to avoid doing the hard work, to avoid making the hard choices. We're so special, it'll work out for us. And I don't think that's what we need. What we need is to say, look, we've done an incredible thing, and now we actually need to get to work and make that meaningful.
David, you have the last word before we open up for audience questions. If you could define a new generational mission, what would it be?
I think that's my favorite question so far. And I have something I want to mention, so I will ask people to pay attention. Now, this is our generational mission. And I'm going to say it, so I'm going to ask that people listen. And I'm going to say it in such a way that it will define a beautiful kind of vision. That is that we have the ability to ensure that we build a safe, prosperous, equal, and united South Africa. And I believe it is possible in one generation. I believe we are that generation in this nation. And I will leave this for your contemplation. When we get to work, as Prophet said, it will allow us joyful jubilation, and it will allow us a great kind of state of pontification. It is something that whether you love it or hate it, you cannot debate it, so you might as well embrace it, because that change is coming and that change is here. And the reason why I emphasize that it is going to happen in one generation is because we need to be intentional about demonstrating that ours is an urgent mission, and it is an urgent vision, but it is a vision that is achievable in one generation. You know, when you do not set a goal for yourself, it becomes very easy, as you mentioned, to avoid establishing some semblance of accountability. Things just fall away, or at some point in the future, we will get to it. And I find that in many conversations, the notion of young people in the future is often used to justify this. But I like to have a saying that young people are not only the future, we are the present. Therefore, our work is now. Therefore, we are the generation doing it now. And I believe it is very possible once more. So I will emphasize that phrase once again: a safe, prosperous, equal, united South Africa, achievable in one generation. And I believe this is the mission and the vision that will drive us towards achieving the ideals that we had envisioned 30 years ago.
And where should people, I suppose it's not really a question of where do they start, but where should they plug in? Because there's a lot of work that's been done already. And maybe people are sitting at home and thinking, well, I'm not quite sure where I can jump in. You know, I pay my taxes and I voted, but what more can I actually do? What would you say to somebody who's asking that question? Where can they plug in where you believe they can make the most impact?
I appreciate that. The best place to plug in is where the issues are. Because what you will find is issue driving has the power to convene. If you show up for a community meeting, and I believe many of us have been there, you will find there are several organizations that often come and are represented in these spaces. It will be very easy to plug into the work that is already happening when you start identifying what the problems are. So whatever community you are in, it is as simple as walking out, identifying what the issues are, looking at people who are working on solving those issues. So what you find is you begin to plug into that network, and that network will grow, it will expand, and so will your influence, your learning, your ability, and your contribution going back into society. So begin where the issues are, and that's where the people will come.
Dr. Mbeda, while we wait for questions, we'll give it just a few more minutes. I did want to go back to the point that Professor O'Connell raised about the gender question, right? I mean, you were on the numbers in terms of the elections and what was happening and the demographics and so on. And one key area there as well is women not perhaps emerging in ways, I suppose it could have been predicted because you know who the leaders are of the various political parties. What are the trends in that regard, right? Is it becoming worse? And perhaps what does it look like to actually shift the dial on that front? We speak highly of, in fact, she's also a UP alumni, Dr. Naledi Pandor, the work she was able to do in the role that she held. But then, you know, she's then replaced by a male minister, and we have to wait until we see yet another powerful woman emerge. What will it actually take to start seeing women in these positions?
Look, I think for South Africa and around women's participation in the elections, 55% of registered voters are women.
Yeah.
Women turn out to vote more than men do. And yet we don't see that translating into actual representation. And to some degree, we've seen a bit of a regression in the representation of women in the National Assembly. I think we're at about 42% now, down from 46% in 2019. And that's really a similar phenomenon to what Prof. Sheena and Prof. Masego were describing about universities, where you are not building a pipeline. So although even at a university we have more women first-year students than males, more female first years than males, it looks completely different at the professoriate, right? And so you're not seeing the pipeline of women being developed all the way through. So with political parties, you were looking at, who becomes the minister, but who are the branch chairs of different political parties? Who are the provincial chairs, the regional chairs? Even though women are the organizers of all of our political parties, the people that are actually pulling community meetings together very often are women, but those women aren't. It's not translating in those women having official and formal power. And I think we're still a very patriarchal society.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that we need to think about around what are those blockages? And in the absence of kind of legal blockages, which we don't have, what is it that's preventing? What is it about our culture, about our societies that is preventing women from being able to emerge into spaces of leadership, despite the fact that in the political sense, women participate politically as voters, as party organizers, but we don't see them emerge into those major positions of leadership. I mean, only one major political party in our country has a woman leader. Of the 18 parties that are represented in the National Assembly, only one of them is led by a woman. Good.
Yes, Patricia.
Exactly. And that's a regression actually from where we were a few years ago. And so there is, I think, a real conversation to be had about what is actually, we say one thing about what our gender representation, about what our commitment to gender equality is, but South Africa remains a very unsafe space for women, country for women. I also think, though, talking about the exceptionalism, this isn't a uniquely South African thing. We've seen globally a huge regression on women's rights in the, in sort of so-called established democracies in the US and in other places, but also on the continent, right? And so there is something, I think, that we are seeing in South Africa that makes us part of a broader global phenomenon. And having these kinds of conversations and raising these questions is really important.
If we can't get the electorate to vote for women, should it then not be easier where the president sits with the prerogative to appoint ministers, that's where it should happen? I mean, we've never had a finance minister. We've had who's a woman. We've had a governor in Jill Marcus. Yes. but not a finance minister. Surely you should trust women with the money.
So I can't remember. So the previous cabinet that we've just had more women ministers than men.
Yeah.
This last cabinet. I can't quite remember what the composition of the current cabinet
Were they
is.
key strategic ministries?
They were. So we've had many defense ministers as women.
Yes.
All of our international relations ministers, bar 2, were women.
Yes.
So currently Ronald Lamola and the very first one, Alfred Nzo. We haven't had women at DTI and at finance. And so I think those are areas where there's certainly improvement to be made. But at the ministerial level, at the cabinet level, we've actually made great progress on gender representation over the years. And it's always sort of hovered around the 50% mark, sometimes a bit less, sometimes more. But that's not the point to be looking at, actually, for systemic change. Is that my concern is that there is not enough, the kinds of growing of the change, because those women that serve in a cabinet where the president is a man are appointed by a man, right? There's still the sense of it being impossible for a woman to be a president. And if we want to deal with that issue, we need to start at the grassroots. It's not something that you can fix by men making particular appointments at different places at the top.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, Professor Masego, I'm going to give you the last word and then we'll wrap things up. Tomorrow is International Nelson Mandela Day, where we commemorate and in fact celebrate also the contribution that the late former head of state of South Africa really made, not only to South Africa but to the globe. Your parting shot really on what International Mandela Day should represent and what you're hoping it inspires among people, what the call of action should be really as we think about what servant leadership at that level has looked like and what we should take forward going into the next 30 years in our democracy.
Well, it's about making a difference wherever we are, be it in our communities, in our workplaces, in our social spaces. It's making a difference and giving back to society, and in ways that Madiba himself articulated after the 27 years that he spent in prison. He still came back and said, I'm going to give all my life to not just South Africa, but to the rest of the world, but also showed leadership that, in fact, when your time to retire comes, don't hold on to power. Give opportunities to other people with skills who can actually make a much bigger contribution than yourself. But it's really about giving back to society.
Absolutely. Let me thank you all for your time with us this evening. Professor Themba Masego, Professor Sheena O'Connell, David Kabwa, Dr. Stembile Mbete, and LJ Fansel. You've been wonderful expert panelists. And thank you to you at home for watching online and joining the conversation. Do, of course, keep a lookout on our various UP social media platforms, as well as our email, your email inbox. We'll send you the email to keep you posted on the next LeadUP Alumni Thought Leadership Conversation and when that will take place. Today's event was brought to you by the University of Pretoria's Alumni Relations team. Until next time, I am Sebenzile Gambule. Good evening.